Today, a pleasure to speak with everyone. As Fred mentioned, I'm a geneticist, so I have a little bit of a different view of precision technologies, but I'll share that amongst my colleagues, this is one of the really exciting areas. How can we use sensors and other high throughput information on the farm to develop new types of management tools, genetic tools, and in some cases to do research to help move industry forward in various areas. So I'm going to talk today about an area that you probably haven't heard as much about. Most folks, when they're talking about sensor technologies and our ear tag sensors being most common, of course, we've got others on farm as well, but they're talking about using those sensors for estrus detection, potentially to identify health events before they occur. We're starting to see more and more nutrition-based modules within these tools and ways to look at if animals are eating or not or ruminating. But something that's a little bit different that we're working on is feed intake and feed efficiency as a way to innovate what could be done with the various types of sensors on farm. So an advantage and a reason why we do that at Iowa State is because we have a kaolin broadbent feeding system. And so that allows us to actually feed individual animals on farm. And I'm going to pull up my laser pointer here quick to kind of help out. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, our kaolin gates at the dairy, on the right, feeding animals. And so the interesting part about this and these kaolin gates is that we can actually feed and monitor intake on individual cows. The cows wear a radio transponder. When they come up to these green gates, that radio collar completes a circuit that allows the gate to open, and then just that cow can eat from that feed bin so that we can measure her daily intake and refusals to get an idea of individual cow variation. So part of the story I'm going to talk about today on a very small part is genetic, in that I'm involved in a consortium to get at feed intake to evaluate feed efficiency from a genetic standpoint to better select bulls and cows. But part of this also involves sensors. And so I'll give you a bit of the backstory of what I had been doing at Iowa State before that project came along. So why monitor feed intake? And I think for most folks on the call, you'll know this straight away. Feed intake is one of the major costs, if not the major cost in production. What you may not know is that a 1% genetic gain in feed efficiency, an improvement, is estimated to be worth about $4.5 million per year to the dairy industry. And with feed efficiency traits, particularly feed saved, which is the one that we've been proposing for the US industry and that's now available for producers. That particular trait has a heritability of 14%. And so there's a considerable opportunity there to improve feed efficiency over time. Improvement of feed efficiency is also an opportunity to reduce the environmental footprint. I think that's a marketing sales point and something that's very relevant given our net zero and other initiatives in the industry. We're not going to get commercial dairies with kaolin gate systems, I don't think. Maybe on very rare occasion, we may have some other types of systems to monitor individual feed intake, but they're very expensive. The Iowa State dairy has somewhere in the neighborhood of $750,000 to a bit over $1 million in kaolin gates. We have very large capacity compared to most universities in the US. But those are not something we would put in a commercial dairy farm because there just isn't the ability there to be profitable. It also requires quite a bit of labor to monitor and measure that individual feed intake. So precision technologies such as different sensors provide opportunities because they might be an informative proxy to tell us about feed intake, and they don't have to tell us the whole story. But if they can help us better understand the variability and the variation in feed intake, even to some degree, and do it consistently and precisely, then we can use that information not only for genetics, but for management decisions. So that's the reason why we're doing what we're doing at Iowa State. We think there's big opportunities. So the first question I'll throw out there is, how do we know if a sensor is a good indicator of feed intake? We want to make sure that we're working with the right kind of sensors. And so ideally, we'd like a consistent association with feed intake. And so I'm showing this plot on the bottom left where it's a hypothetical situation. I've got feed intake on the y-axis and a sensor measure, or say, for example, information from milk testing on the x-axis. So ideally, we'd have a linear trend, but really it could be anything where we can use statistics to accurately relate our sensor trait to feed intake and constantly be able to predict what feed intake will be from that sensor measure. And as a geneticist, of course, we're very interested in the relationships with other traits of interest. So as an example that I think is a good one with the types of sensors we're going to talk about, I've put out health problems or health incidents. And so ideally, if we had, for example, an association between a sensor with activity where activity was up and that increased activity had a statistical association that was favorable with feed efficiency, we would like to see, for example, reduced incidence of health events associated with that. Now, there are ways of getting around those relationships if they're not favorable, but that would just be the ideal situation. So in our first experiment that I undertook at Iowa State with sensors, we asked, how are sensor measures associated with feed intake in lactating Holstein dairy cows? And so we started out with a relatively small subset of animals of 108 between 50 and 200 days of milk, as that's the easiest time in general to the most accurate time, in general, to estimate feed efficiency and feed intake consistently. We measured feed intake with the Kaelin Gates, and then we account for a number of different items such as milk weight, body weight, and then investigate our various sensors. And so an important part in all of this research is that I'm going to show you is that we're not just looking for animals that eat less feed. We want animals that preferably eat the least feed per unit of production and per unit of use. So we don't want cows that are really big, that are not using their energy as efficiently. They're not milking as well. They're not producing milk components as well. We would ideally like an animal that per unit of feed they eat maximizes milk production, milk yield, and components, and is hopefully stably keeping their body weight and not fluctuating around a lot. So that's why we account for those things. And we've looked at a number of different types of ear tags. We looked at a rumen bolus technology, as well as environmental sensors in our barns, although I'll mention that for that work, it ended up being really closely related to our airport data. And so we actually use airport data because the correlation was very close to 1 between our in-barn environmental sensors and the Iowa State Airport. So the next question then is, well, are these sensor measures actually associated with the feed intake that we see? And so I'm going to talk about feed intake on a daily basis that's been adjusted to a dry matter basis. So the actual differences that we would see on farm would be a little bit bigger. And I'm just going to kind of give you the highlights. If someone wants to know more about the statistics and the technical details, we can talk more about that after my talk. But just briefly, sensor measures such as ear tag activity, rumen bolus activity, and rumen temperature were all statistically significantly associated with feed intake and our measures of daily feed efficiency. And we also are a little bit on the fence yet with rumen pH. We see kind of a tendency towards a relationship, but as those rumen boluses tend to be a little bit more expensive to get pH data, we don't have enough data yet, I think, to see that solid relationship, but it does look interesting. Rumen health obviously is related to pH, so that's something we wanted to at least investigate. So one of my next questions, because we get seasonal heat stress in Iowa, is what's the relationship between these sensors and heat stress, and does it impact our ability to look at how these sensors pick up changes in feed intake? And so I'm going to tell you about 2 different sets of findings. We do see differences in sensor measures based on heat intake, and in general, I would say it makes our sensors more sensitive. In that more types of measurements that we've investigated have a statistically significant relationship. And in general, those relationships are stronger for ear tag activity, temperature, rumen bolus activity, rumen temperature, as well as rumen pH becomes statistically significant when we consider heat stress as THI, thermal heat index, in our statistical models. Now, there are some sensors whose relationships with feed intake actually change depending on the level of heat stress measured by THI, and that would be ear tag activity and temperature. So moving forward, these are the kind of things and how we use these sensors that need to be dug in more. Obviously, we go after the most basic things and the most helpful things initially, and so this is where the research, I think, will refine some of our sensors and make some tweaks when there's potentially some small issues with different environmental things going on in the herd. And then our next big question was related to health. And so I'm really interested in health events in dairy cattle. I think it's a real opportunity if we can improve health with sensors to improve the efficiency of animals. And so we wanted to ask a couple of questions, and I'll share some of that information. How do health events impact the ability of a sensor to detect differences in feed intake? So if we've got sensors on animals, they become lame, they get mastitis, maybe they end up with multiple issues or an injury or something different. Does that change the way that we can use our sensors to see variability in feed intake in animals? And then what's the impact of a health event on feed intake and efficiency as well, so that we can start to characterize what that economic impact is on feed intake in cows and efficiency. I'll just briefly mention, we also looked at how long we ought to account for the effect of that illness, if it ought to be kind of isolated to the time when that event was clinical, what we call a time of illness event, or if we should even consider it longer term throughout the rest of the lactation. I won't present that information, but I throw it out there because I think it is an important consideration. A lot of times our health events don't have just short isolated impact on production. They actually extend out further into the lactation and maybe further out, and depending on the type of health event that's occurred. So coming back to those initial questions about how illness and health events in the herd impact use of sensors to look at variability in feed intake in cows. And so again, this is going to focus on, in this slide, what happens when we focus at that time of kind of the acute illness when it's clinically being observed. So sensor measures are impacted by health. In fact, it's really almost all of our measurements that we look at, all of our activity and temperature measurements, and now we can even see relationships with rumen pH and rumination. And that's not surprising. We think about rumen health, and a lot of times when animals are sick, that's when we're going to see these measurements start to impact the intake and the health of that animal. You know, these things aren't surprising. We know when cows go off a feed, a lot of times that's an indication of an illness or an impending illness or something coming up. And so then when it comes to sensors and how their relationships change with different health events, it's really every measurement that we look at. So I think it's going to be important moving forward that folks account for these health events as they're developing these sensor technologies. We do need to replicate some of these results, as we have a relatively small data set. We're in the process of doing that now, and I have a feeling that those results are probably going to hold. So finally, you know, I wanted to talk a little bit about what is the impact of those health events on daily feed intake and efficiency. And this is a little bit of an aside, but in looking at our sensor measurements and doing this research, I think that was important to start to quantify what those differences are. And as we use our sensors, if we can think about, you know, how we prevent health events or monitor them, or try to do things to identify individuals with an illness earlier to lessen the effect of an illness, this becomes a really important piece of it, because that production and efficiency that we lose during illness is obviously lost profit and lost sustainability, if you will, in the herd. So I apologize, this slide's a little bit busy, but I'll try to walk you through it quickly. What I have is differences between a given health event, and in this case, I'm showing you primarily lameness and mastitis. So lameness is in red, mastitis is in yellow, and it's deviated from healthy animals. So the healthy is set at 0, we go up or down. What you can think of it really as is a change from the baseline efficiency. It's not necessarily that one's better than the other, but it's how much are we varying from those healthy animals in feed intake. So we're bouncing around with our different sensor measures that we've used, somewhere between about 1 kilogram, getting up close to 2 kilograms, and in some of our more recent data, maybe even as high as 2.5 kilograms of feed intake or feed efficiency measured per day per animal with a health event. And in particular, lameness is the one that really seems to hit the cows hard. I will mention that at the Iowa State Dairy, we can't look at all events of lameness, so these would be mild bouts of lameness. And when I talk to my colleagues at the National Animal Disease Labs at USDA here in Ames, if you can and when you can monitor the impact on feed intake of a full-blown case of mastitis, it's much more severe. So these are mild estimates, but they're estimates that we can pick up of how illness impacts feed intake. So let's put that into something maybe that's a little bit easier to conceptualize. So gross feed efficiency, just looking essentially into outputs over inputs as a means of efficiency. With lameness, we see that increased feed consumption, in the animals, but we also see decreased milk production. So that's leading to a reduction in the efficiency of those animals. With mastitis, we see decreased feed consumption and also decreased milk production. And so just visualizing that, when we look at our lame animals here in red compared to our control healthy animals, which is in brown in both of these plots, you can see that reduced efficiency in lameness, in this case, where a higher number is better, and the same in mastitis, where our individuals with mastitis are less efficient than our healthy animals, which obviously makes sense, but starting to put some numbers with what those changes actually are. So, our next question really is, if you can start to identify these associations, so sensors are associated with feed intake, we're pretty confident in that. Can you actually start to predict feed intake in the future based on your sensor measurements? And so this work is ongoing, but we've seen some interesting results looking at both ear tag measurements and rumen bolus measurements. Our predictive ability is not real high. We can predict with about 40% 40 to 50% accuracy with our models. And as we stack information together, in general, our accuracies improve. If you think about this in context of genetics, though, this is actually a higher predictive ability than we have from genetics today. So it'll be interesting to see, on top of genetic effects, how much more variation in feed intake we could account for. And so we're talking about a boost from ear tags of about 1% in our prediction accuracy of feed intake by using that activity data from ear tags, and about a 4% boost from rumen bolus data. And I will add that we're working to currently add a lot more data, especially for the ear tags, to validate these results. The rumen boluses are a bit more expensive, so we're working on some follow-up data. I'm not sure if they'll be as used in the industry, but it's interesting, and we certainly want to follow that lead in case there's a way to modify that technology or the price point changes such that it could become a more commonly used technology. Maybe just one last point on this slide. It's not necessarily the amount of increase in accuracy, but a lot of what we're interested in is, how can you just improve the accuracy? So if each added piece of information adds more accuracy, it's a win. So with both of these technologies, if we can stack them on top of each other in our statistical predictions and improve prediction of feed intake by adding each one, it's a win with each technology. And really what we would like to do, and what I'm trying to help do with a consortium of 4 different universities, University of Wisconsin, University of Florida, Michigan State, and Iowa State, as well as USDA and the Council for Dairy Cattle Breeding through a Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research grant, is look at how we can now expand this data to use it on a commercial level. So we've seen associations with sensors at Iowa State. We're not the only ones. There was a recent report from Denmark that sees associations between activity and feed intake. We have colleagues at the University of Wisconsin who've done some work with milk testing data, milk spectra that are generated in predicting our components from the samples that go to DHIA, for example. And so we're looking at different ways to combine all of that different data that's available at the farmer level to better predict feed efficiency. And so if we could do that, what we can do is boost our accuracies of prediction such that we can improve that PTA that's been put out, that's called PTA feed saved for the industry. Just briefly, I'll show you that we're looking at a number of different sensors on this project, including vaginal sensors, milking collar sensors, and also starting to get into image technology. Iowa State will contribute a good chunk of the data. We're going to have sensor data on about 3,000 cows. Iowa State will generate from about 600. And really, again, the goals of this project are to combine the genomic information that we have with all of these different sensors that we hope are proxies, and that we believe now, based on the initial data, are proxies for feed intake, to identify statistical relationships with feed efficiency and those various sensor measures, and then develop our statistical methods combining all of this information to leverage that data and better predict feed efficiency. So that goal really with adding the sensor data is to increase the accuracy of predicting feed intake with that added sensor data to go along with feed intake, body weight, our production traits, and genomic information. So finally, here in the last slide or two, I'll tell you a little bit about ongoing research. We've been ramping up our work with CowManager tags as well as image data. We're starting to roll out on the farm with a project with a colleague in electrical engineering to really look at unique kinds of information that we can glean from the dairy herd. Part of that project is also looking into the importance of how do we get rural broadband out into the community. That's outside of my research area, but with what we're doing, there's a lot of interest in how could you use rural broadband to help folks monitor farms, transfer data to be able to get helpful analytics to producers and to develop new analytics like a predictive equation for feed intake. So a few last take-home points from the talk today. We're testing multiple types of sensors at the Iowa State Dairy Farm as potential indicators of feed intake in Holstein dairy cows. Sensor measurements have been associated with feed intake and health, though I didn't talk about the health data today. Heat stress and illness seem to be impacting how sensor measures relate to feed intake are going to be important, I believe, in interpretation of how we would use sensors for understanding feed intake. Mild mastitis and lameness, based on our estimates, are costing somewhere between 2 to 6 pounds of lost feed efficiency per cow per day. Genetic prediction tools are being developed along with a number of colleagues to help develop this PTA feed saved that you may be seeing now that's available for selection of feed intake. And we hope that our sensor data that's coming in will eventually contribute to that evaluation as well to help improve our accuracy and prediction for those genetic tools. And then just finally, I want to say, I think sensor data is really promising for predicting feed intake. And I think we're going to have some really exciting things coming out and very applicable tools for the industry soon. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge our funding from the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, the Council for Dairy Cattle Breeding, my collaborators at the various institutions, and thank Fred for the opportunity to talk today, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Fred. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, sure can.
Okay. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with you this afternoon. Just a few overview slides of CowManager. So here is the orange sensor itself. It fits over an EID button or a blank button that you can get. So what does this sensor do? It actually measures rumination, eating time, inactivity time, high activity when a cow's in heat, normal activity when she's walking back and forth to the parlor, to the feed bunk. And this sensor also does measure temperature. How the system works is the cows have where the ear sensor, as long as they're within 300 or 400 feet of a router, that information is going to be sent every 15 minutes. From the routers, it sends it to a coordinator that's by the computer. That distance can be up to 3,000 feet. A lot of it depends on the facilities. From the computer, that information is sent to the internet. And then you're simply accessing that information back on your smartphone or any computer in the world. So with this program, there is no software. This is cloud-based. The information is sent to the Netherlands, and then you're getting it back. CowManager does interface with multiple management systems, so that can be done as well. So that's what I have for just a brief overview. I'd like to, I'll stop sharing now and introduce Caitlin Wubin from Maassen Dairy.
Yeah, I'm a herdsman here at Maassen Dairy Farms in Northwest Iowa, near Sioux Center. You know where that's at. I do most of the herd work with the cows. We just started using CowManager about the 1st of October. So we got 5 or 6 months worth of data on it, I guess. I just get a little bit of overview of our herd. We got about 1,700 cows right now, dry and milking. About 85-pound average, 4.3 butter fat, 3.3 protein. We have CowManager tags in all our cows, and we also put them in our breeding age heifers. We're using the fertility and health modules on the tag. There's also a nutrition module, I know, and there's a Find My Cow module too. Those cost a little bit more, so we're just on the fertility and the health right at the moment. Probably start with the health because I don't have as much data on that, but so the CowManager will trigger if a cow is flagged for some reason, whether it's a temperature, whether it's she's not active, or rumination dropped way down. So yeah, I guess it saves me a lot of walking pens and stuff because I can usually pull up my phone and go look at cows. There's a suspicious, there's a sick, and there's a very sick. Usually I personally look at the very sick cows, otherwise you're looking at cows all day long. But usually, yeah, there's something wrong with them if they're very sick. Can't always figure it out right away. But so yeah, we're still kind of learning how to treat those cows and what to do with them. But usually if they are on the very sick list, they're on there for a reason. Even if you don't see it the first day, you'll figure it out by the second day. And also we were using it for fertility. I can have a few slides on that as well, but we're using it. We used to time breed everything. First, second service, we'd catch maybe 5% natural heats. We didn't do any tail chalk or anything, just the ones we kind of saw. But so we still pre-sync, out-sync everything to the first service. So almost every cow is getting bred the first time between 70 and 80 days. That makes it a little easier for us. And the 21-day heats are also synced up a little bit more. And yeah, it just gets the cow started at a good time. We catch a few beforehand that'll show an early heat, but most of them are getting their first service timed. Yeah, I guess that didn't talk, but so how it shows that a cow's in heat is it shows it by their activity. It'll have a graph on there, and then yeah, there's a line kind of their normal activity, and then when they're in heat, it spikes. Then yeah, you kind of breed them in the green. Hopefully, just when they're past their peak is ideal. We usually only breed once a day. Probably if you wanted to get a little higher conception, you could breed twice a day. Get a little bit more accurately. And just kind of some repro reports. Hopefully you can read this. I kind of just snapshot them, but this is our days in milk, our conception rate. This is the one on the left is the beforehand. So this is to be like April to September. And this is our yeah, percent bred, and then our conception rate based on that. This is just, yeah, a little interesting to me is we're getting more cows pregnant before 200 days, I guess. About 5% cows more pregnant for 200 days, and our conception rates are a little higher as well. But, shows it more in the preg rate, I guess. So yeah, this is, I guess, October through March. So yeah, it was when I was doing this too, I realized that the ones kind of through the summer months and the others through the winter where you have a little higher conception anyways, but it is significant once I get to like the preg rate. I have to take my word that it is higher than normal. So yeah, so this is just by month, I guess, preg rate. Beforehand we're upper 30s to about 40, and afterwards we're consistently well over 40%. So I'd say we gain maybe 2 to 3% conception, maybe you take into account the weather, I guess, the summer months, the heat stress. So this is a preg rate. This really shows it. I guess we're normally about 23, I guess, average preg rate. And then as soon as we hit CowManager there in November, we're consistently over 30. So jumped 5 to 6% in preg rate. So then yeah, the last slide just kind of shows we're getting a lot more cows pregnant in shorter time. The highest I ever saw was about 100. So they're easy 20 to 30 cows a month more. Same thing with the heifers, because we're using Manager to breed our heifers as well. So getting heifers pregnant a little quicker, and yeah, quite a few more of them. So I think that's all I had.
All right, well, thank you, Fred, and certainly want to thank you for the forum here and the opportunity to share today. As Fred mentioned, my name is Scott Metzger. I'm in a role as a Central Plains Sales Manager with SCR and Allflex. Cover Western Iowa and Western Minnesota, along with the Dakotas and Nebraska. So kind of a growing area that's seeing a lot of cows coming into it over the last decade and will continue to do so. I live in the far northwest corner of Iowa, a little town called Lester, with my family here. And I am a 2002 graduate of Iowa State with a degree in dairy science and ag business. So a little bit about our organization. SCR has been around for a while. They were established in 1976, looking at different technologies for gathering information from cows, everything from milking equipment to eventually sensor technology. SCR was the first organization to add rumination monitoring to their portfolio for predicting health events. And our technology has been in the US for over a decade now on dairy farms. In 2014, SCR was acquired by Allflex. While a lot of people in the dairy industry still know our monitoring system by the name of SCR, it is now under the Allflex umbrella. And then in 2018, Allflex was acquired by Merck. So that's a long way of saying we're part of a fairly large organization that is committed to continuing to find ways to manage animals successfully and with the best possible outcomes. When we look at what SCR and Allflex do as far as monitoring, we monitor reproduction, we monitor health, and we also monitor group aspects of a dairy herd. And each of these are different pieces the dairyman can choose to look at for different groups depending on what they want to invest in the technology. When we look at how our system looks on farm, we have a couple of different options for how we can apply the technology. We have two different form factors for our devices. The device can either be a collar or it can be an ear tag. And there's certainly, pros and cons of both of those two different devices. The platform for use of the system, we also have two different options there as well. One is the HeatTime Pro platform, which is a PC-based system. And the second is what we call SenseHub, which is a cloud-based system for use of the data. And again, there's certainly advantages for both of those platforms and producers that very successfully use both. Along with our monitoring technology, part of our full management solution that we bring to dairymen is the ability to use our sort gates for managing cows, and also our milking points. So you could integrate milk, daily milk weights in the parlor, along with the ability to identify and sort cows that need attention, all from the same platform there. And with that, I'm going to turn the table over to Dr. Mike Bossum. Dr. Bossum is a consulting veterinarian in DeWitt, Iowa. He works with herds ranging from 200 to 3,500 cows. He has over 5 years of experience working with the SCR system through his client base. And Dr. Bossum is also a dairy producer, as he is a partner in Northside Genetics, which is a 900 cow herd. And this past summer, they installed the SCR system in their own herd. And I will turn it over to Mike and let him speak about his experiences with the system.
Scott and everybody else on the panel. My name is Dr. Mike Gossam, and I have the unique perspective of being both a veterinarian and a dairy producer, and have used these systems on both accounts. I don't have any slides prepared. I guess I'd like to make this more of a question and answer if we could, but a couple things about it. I think these systems, and like I said, I have the SCR system in our dairy, so I'm kind of partial to that system, even though I'm familiar with both CowManager and SCR. But I think these systems are a must-have for a dairy of any size. It's not just a large dairy technology to use. It really comes in handy for any size dairy. It monitors cows 24/7, 365, and obviously no person can do that. I compare it very much to a necessity, just like a computer program, Dairy Comp 305, PC Dart, Bovasync, whatever program you have. I mean, I can't imagine being, managing a dairy without a computer system. I can't imagine managing a dairy now without these monitoring technologies. They're just so valuable. When we put it in our dairy in July of 2020, I want to say that within 10 days, 2 weeks, it was already paying for the first month's payment in finding cows that were that were sick that we would have not found. I tell the story from that perspective of the first week when we had good data. After about 5 to 7 days, the health cows showed up on the list, and we went and found every one of those cows. And I generally use 300 minutes of rumination as my cutoff. As to anything that's under 300 minutes, I'm going to go check that cow out. There's other monitors on there, but that's kind of just the first one I look at is 300 minutes of rumination. And when we went and looked at those cows, to our eye, you really didn't think that there was anything wrong with those cows. You thought they looked normal, they had milk, nothing obvious. But I said, let's go ahead and take every cow up. We're gonna check every cow. We found something wrong with every one of those cows. Whether it be a mild ketosis, a metritis, a fever of unknown origin, or from pneumonia. A couple of, maybe there was a little bit of foot rot that you didn't really notice walking around, but as you looked at her farther, you found that. And we treated every one of those cows, and by 24, 48 hours, they were all back ruminating normally and off your sick cow list. So we would have not pulled those cows had it not been for the monitoring system. From a veterinary standpoint, I've got several herds using both, some using SCR, some using CowManager, and it just really, unfortunately for me a little bit, it shortened my time at each of those dairies. The preg checks became much fewer cows to check because they were finding the cows back in heat, just a lot like Caleb said. So the cows I was checking for pregnancy were a much larger percentage were pregnant, which means you're resyncing less cows. So from that standpoint, it raises your meat production rate, somewhere in that 10 to 15%, which equates to a much higher preg rate, like Caleb showed in his report. There's other technologies like SortGate. I have one 1,500 cow dairy that has a SortGate technology in. I think that's also another very valuable tool. You don't have to enter the pen, and as we know, when you enter pens, cows get up, they move around instead of increasing their lying time. So the SortGate will, depending on what you're doing that day, sorts out a sick cow, sorts out a cow in heat. you can get at that cow right away, get her back to the pen as quickly as possible, get her back eating, and you move on without a day. It makes you much more efficient. When I asked my producers before we even had it, I said, the repro is amazing on these things, but to a T, they all said it really isn't the repro that's the biggest benefit. It's more the health monitoring. Finding cows out in mid-lactation that their rumination is off, that you would have never found before, and getting those cows, treated with either just a minor treatment of a drench or a little bit of calcium, and then right back, to normal milk production they go. So and I would agree with that now that we've got it. The health monitoring is probably the most important part of it, and the repro is right there just behind it as well. I guess that's kind of just my my views, from both the veterinary standpoint and the actually dairy owner standpoint. Anybody have any specific questions?
All right, well, thanks everybody for your input on the sensor technologies. It's great to hear the different perspective and kind of some of the research coming down the pike as we look at all of these technologies. And I guess one question that came in, and this could be for both Caleb and Mike here, is what was kind of your decision or thought process in implementing the activity monitoring system? So maybe some things that triggered you to be thinking about it a little bit more seriously, and how you decided to implement it.
Well, for us, I guess, I'm not the owner, I'm the herdsman, so I sat in on a lot of stuff. I guess the data and the money return that it showed, I guess is one thing that really pushed us to it. I guess we had looked into it a couple of years ago too, and we didn't feel like the data maybe was quite up to snuff. I think they've come a long way in the last couple of years in getting things narrowed down and getting things pretty accurate. Yeah, I guess I agree with Mike too that the health thing is, yeah, they say probably saves you more money actually than the fertility does, just because you can catch cows so much sooner. Yeah, cows you wouldn't even think are sick, or even quite frankly in heat. Some of those cows, their activity's up, but they don't look like they're in heat, but you arm them and sure enough they're doned up pretty nice. So yeah, I guess that was the main thing that pushed us to that. And yeah, I guess using less shots, that seems to be where the industry's headed too. So just trying to think of ways to improve, I guess.
With cow health and cow reproduction, than what we were doing, and we decided to put it in. It was, like I said, I wish I could go back in time and put it in day one, because it's not an investment. It's more of a necessity. I mean, it just makes you so much better as a cow manager, cow owner, veterinarian. I mean, it just makes you better, because it tells you everything about that cow every minute of the day, every day. We also decided to put it in our breeding age heifers as well. And the math there actually just, is very, very simple. We put 100 collars on our breeding age heifers. Basically, we pre-breed vaccinate them, put a collar on, it stays on through preg check. And before we had the collars, we were giving prostaglandin shots every 2 weeks. And so that was our sync program on the heifers. The amount of money we spent just in the prostaglandin alone versus the money per month that we're spending on the SCR system, and we're spending more money in prostaglandin than we are per month on the collar. So, we actually are saving money by doing better in the heifers. So that was an easy math situation there.
Great, good thoughts there from both of you. And my next question is both for Ted and Scott. Just kind of talking about, as you're visiting with producers about the technology, what what kind of challenges or things do you talk to your producers about that they maybe should have in place before they decide to implement this type of technology? Because just like all technologies, you know, we just can't put it in and, you know, just walk away from it, right? So there's still management that needs to happen. Walk us through what you visit with your producers.
Yes, I'll go first, if that's all right, Ted. You know, I think one of the biggest things with any technology is making sure that there's buy-in from the parties that are going to be using the technology on a day-to-day basis. You know, you really need to make sure that somebody on the farm is bought in, and then they are going to embrace it and take ownership for use of the system. You know, we've run into situations where maybe the owner you know, loves the idea, but you know, the herds person or the person who's going to be actually implementing the information from the system feels threatened by it or challenged by it, and those can be, you know, a little bit challenging. But when you have, you know, the ownership of the dairy and the herdsmen and everybody that's working with the cows on a day-to-day basis bought in, you know, you can really get your highest return on investment. You know, certainly there's, you know, there's technical aspects of with the system that you need to, you know, talk through as well, you know, ensure that you have adequate coverage and that you know, put enough antennas in the barn and things like that. But probably the first thing you want to talk through with them is who's going to be using the information and how are they going to implement it and what changes are they going to make. Because if they're not willing to make changes with the information they get, realistically, then they're just spending a bunch of money for some fancy graphs. So it has to translate into actionable information or actionable change on the farm. Ted?
Nice job, Scott. That's kind of how I approach it too. This technology is a tool for the farm. We could make an average person look really, really good, or they might go backwards if they don't use this technology. So it's really important that they understand how the system works and what the expectations of them are using the system.
Yeah. And you know, you touched on something there, Ted, that I'd like to segue into as well. You know, the system, you know, it can certainly shine, you know, with you know, an average producer who's challenged on labor and needs help. I mean, it can really make a difference there. And you know, conversations I've had with producers, you know, sometimes go along the lines of, well, you know, we're doing great already. You know, we don't need this technology, and that's a fair statement. But the fact of the matter is, like many technologies, it really shines in the hands of good managers. So even if a dairyman, if they're doing a good job already and they're a great manager, it can still help them do better. So, you know, as Mike alluded to, you know, every farm can probably benefit from the use of monitoring technology, no matter their size.
I'm going to interrupt Jen's train of thought. Both of you have made the comment, no matter what size. Is there a sweet spot? I mean, with a 60 cow herd, it sounds like there's some things that it's going to help them do, but is there a sweet spot where, you know, this size herd really sees the most bang?
I'll let you go first on this one, Ted.
Okay, thanks, Scott. I don't know if there's necessarily a sweet spot. I think I have herds that have 20 sensors for heifers or several thousand sensors. I think it has to do with maybe the sweet spot is depending on the labor situation. If we're short of labor, some of these technologies replace 1 or 2 employees in the farm that are, and these technologies are working 24/7. So I don't know of a good sweet spot or not. Scott, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it truly can apply to any size herd, and yeah, I mean, labor is probably one of the biggest factors guys look at when determining, how much of a return or how quick the return is with the system. Like you alluded to, we have, we have 20, 30 heifer tag systems out there, and we have, farms with over 10,000 animals that have devices on every animal. So it truly is scalable, and I think it can apply to a lot of different size herds.
And Scott, you brought up a good point earlier about, if you're implementing this technology, you should be able to glean some good information off of that and make some management decisions. So my question goes back to Caleb and Mike. So how are you using these technologies with your transition cows? Because we know that's a critical time. So we talk about the pre-fresh and then getting into that calving and all those metabolic issues that can happen. So are you able to identify more sick cows earlier, any issues, or helping to identify cows that have any calving issues?
Put them on our springers about 2 to 3 weeks before they calve. And yeah, the cows always have them on too. I know on the nutrition module with CowManager, they had just put something on new, and we had a free trial of it that actually had a transition cow part of it that would flag cows that might have issues calving or had some sort of health deal during their dry period. So you should have watched them a little closer. But yeah, it definitely does catch cows quicker, especially like for me, if I ever have a DA or something, if I dump a cow in a group out of fresh, seems like those are the ones that get a DAs if they don't quite transition quite good enough. So that'll catch that real quick, a lot faster than probably you would have just looking at them. But yeah, the metritis and catches that a little quicker too. We have a little problem with ammonia. Those are on there real quick too. But yeah, I don't know about calving so much. There's a little bit, I guess. If you have a really hard problem calver, they'll be on there. But yeah, it's hard to predict it based on the activity when they're going to calve. That was part of the question.
And Scott or Ted, do you have any other input on that?
The calving's kind of tricky. I think with at least CowManager, it can predict some calvings, it predicts problems with calvings if the cow's having issues. A cow laying down, having a calf within 20 minutes and getting back up. I don't know if any sensor is really going to pick that up unless you're using a vaginal probe or something.
Yeah, I would agree with that. As was mentioned previously, every cow is typically going to show a rumination pattern where as they approach calving, rumination drops, and then if everything is normal, it quickly recovers. But, how quickly they drop in relation to calving is quite different from cow to cow. And, it's probably very challenging to predict with a lot of accuracy exactly when that cow is going to calve. As Ted alluded to, our system will give a distress alert if a cow is, experiencing calving problems. But, as far as being able to, predict that this cow is going to calve, 3.5 hours from now, I don't, as Ted said, I don't know if there's any system out there that can do that prediction with a high degree of accuracy.
How many people can have access? Can my vet, my nutritionist, my dairy specialist, how many people can be monitoring your systems? Is that a possibility?
So I guess with our system, depending on the platform that you're on, if you're using the Sense Hub cloud-based system, you could you could have basically unlimited number of users access that. You just have to give them the login information for that account there. If you're going to use the Heat Time Pro PC-based system, they could access the data from that from the mobile app. So they could, for example, if you wanted your herdsman to, want to find out which cows were in heat, they could open up the app and get that information there. But as far as directly accessing the information on the PC, your consultant could certainly access that via TeamViewer with that platform, or we could put a client version on multiple computers around the farm as well. So both platforms offer a pretty high degree of accessibility. Really just depends on who the owner wants to grant access to.
With the CowManager system, since it's cloud-based, we can let any person in the world have access to the CowManager information. The producer can decide what they can see and what they can and can't do. And the phone app is free for anyone also.
Our herd health veterinarian and our nutritionist are the same person actually, but yeah, he has access to it. He has it all on his phone too, so he can watch it and monitor it if he wants.
In your slides with the mastitis and locomotion issues, obviously some major hits on feed consumption and milk production with locomotion. Have you seen anything on the locomotion monitors? Is that something? I mean, we see them in some of the other species.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so regarding, locomotion monitoring, there are other types of sensors that are starting to come out. It's interesting. The activity is definitely impacted on those animals. I don't know if it's as severely impacted as the feed intake. The feed intake really takes a hit. But we are hearing about some of these new technologies coming out. We've been investigating to see if it might be interesting ones to get on the farm for research purposes moving forward.
Right. Well, I want to thank everybody for being on the Zoom call here today, and hopefully we provided some good information and good decision-making process if people are looking to decide to implement any type of sensor technology, and provide you some good resources and follow up if you have any questions. I did put the evaluation link into the chat box here, so if before you log off, if you wouldn't mind clicking on that and filling that out, should take only a couple of minutes. Again, it's just to help us evaluate our programs and know what kind of future programs we should be offering. So with that, I'm going to close, and I hope to see many of you on April 22nd as we talk about automatic milking systems coming up with our precision technology webinar series. So I hope everybody has a good afternoon, and we'll talk to you soon.